Alrighty, welcome to the first unintended consequences of urban intensification ad hoc committee of January 17, 2023. Attendance has been taken, and I will proceed with the election of chair and vice chair before handing off the meeting to the chair. With that said, do I have any nominations for chair? Mayor Bailey?
Councillor Bell.
Thank you. Councillor Bell, do you accept? Do I have any more nominations for the role of chair? Seeing none, all in favor of Councillor Bell being the chair? That carries. Okay, can I please, I'm now looking for nominations of vice chair. Do I have any nominations for the role of vice chair? Councillor House?
I'll nominate Christine Garneau.
Councillor Garneau, do you accept? Okay. All those in favor? That carries. Okay, Councillor Bell, you now have the chair. Please join me at the head of the horseshoe, and you have done so, and proceed to the next item on the agenda.
And the next item on the agenda is
Approval of the agenda.
Could somebody make a motion to approve the agenda? Thank you, Councillor Garneau, seconded by the Mayor. Any comments, any additions that we'd like to have? No, seeing none, call the vote. All those in favour? Thank you. The terms of review, I'm going to actually say a few things before we get going, because I think it's important to put it in this meeting into context. So bear with me, if you would. We can. If anybody wants to declare a pecuniary interest, if they could do so now or at an appropriate time in the meeting. We're always looking at Councillor Garneau because she holds the world record for conflicts. Okay, thank you. So we have been tasked to identify the unintended consequences of urban intensification. I think when I wrote it down the first time it was residential intensification, but I can live with urban intensification. And our task is to find approaches, ways forward to address these consequences. So I hadn't given much thought to the formality of these meetings. I thought when you had an ad hoc committee, then we could sit in a quiet room and talk informally and throw ideas out and kick things around and then call on staff to help us move the things forward. But this is not the private sector. This is not what I was used to. This is the municipal sector, and we are required to have formality and transparency and openness. But I think that can work in our favour, because one of the things that we can do is basically advertise the fact that we have this ad hoc committee to people that live in our county, particularly those in Paris, and seek from them input, which I think will be helpful. And I know that we've been very successful with Engage Brant on many projects, and the product of the input has been really valuable. So that's something I think we need to get to a little later. But to intensification, today it's focused on Paris, but it will, in coming years, focus will shift to St. George. And with Councillor Garneau here, there may be pockets elsewhere in the county where we see the same thing happening. We should learn from the experience of others. I liken what we're seeing in Paris today to basically a wave coming out of the centre of Toronto, and it passed Mississauga about 15 years ago, it passed Oakville about 10 years ago, probably passed Hamilton 5 years ago, and we are here today feeling the effects of it. So they experienced the level and the speed of growth that we are now seeing, and they must have had the same issues, and they must have learned from them, and they will have made mistakes along the way that I don't want to find us repeating. When somebody asks you when's the best time to plant a tree, they always say, 20 years ago, and if not, then now. And the same is true for this issue. We should have had this discussion 10 years ago, and we're going back probably 2 or 3 councils now, and they should have said, well, we are going to expand the southwest of Paris and the north of Paris. What might be the consequences of that? But we didn't. But what we should do is, nevertheless, learn from the work that others have and the experience that others have had. And we should not repeat mistakes. That will be a sin in my world. So some of the issues are obvious, and we have Brandon at the back of the room here, who later this evening will talk about parking in Paris, and that's perhaps the most transparent and obvious challenge that we face in respect of intensification in our town, but it's certainly not the only thing. Social media is a great place to go and find what is concerning people about Paris growing, and will concern people about St. George when it grows. So I've got my list, and I think the list is in the documentation, but just for the record, and we can work through it again later, I've got parking, traffic management, brackets, for example, Mile Hill changes, fireworks, safety on urban streets, the design and sufficiency of parks and recreational facilities, an old favourite, chickens in backyards, inappropriate structures in backyards, which was actually the issue that caused us to come to this point. And you know, Councillor Chambers pointed us towards the formal solution to addressing that particular issue. Planning policies and standards, and I'm glad we have our policy team in the room, because ultimately an awful lot of what comes out of this, I believe, will need to be reflected in policies and standards. And then it will end up in the hands of our bylaw team when they have to do some enforcement thereof. There's a potential for social disorder, and that may sound extreme, but my experience elsewhere in the world tells me once you start putting lots of people together, the potential for social disorder grows. We have to assimilate multi-ethnic residents into our communities. This is new to Paris. It is something that you see increasingly day by day, and we need to recognize what we said on the vision for this county, and that was an inclusive community, and we need to make sure that it is inclusive, but there are steps we probably need to take to make sure that works out as well as it possibly can do. We have to think about bylaw enforcement resourcing, and I know that's going to come up in our budget discussions next week. We need to think about the availability of appropriate retail facilities. I've lost count of the number of times I've been asked, when am I going to get a grocery store in southwest Paris? And the answer is, I don't know. Better ask Vicano, they're the people that have the facilities there. But it's not an unreasonable question, because the consequences of not having a grocery store in southwest Paris means that people will drive through Paris to go to the north end, or they'll drive across the high-level bridge to No Frills, or they'll drive out of the county, which actually has an economic consequence to it. One of the things that John Pierce and I came across recently was some concerns from residents in the Granville Circle area about littering. And it became clear that one of the consequences of rapid growth, and it is also a consequence of many of the homes there now not being actually owned but being rented, there has been a clear lack of pride developing in that community. And we saw littering all over the place. It wasn't construction litter, it was household litter that people didn't take the time, as they would do in many neighborhoods, just go and pick it up and clean up. So that shift in balance between home ownership and rental occupation is a subtle thing. It will have subtle impacts, but we need to be aware of it. And I'm sure places to the east of us have seen this already and will know how to go forward. And one that I hadn't thought about, which Councillor Garneau mentioned to me, was tree planting. And you may think, well, what's tree planting got to do with this? Well, if you plant the wrong trees in your very small back garden, you can create a havoc with both the foundations of your property, but also the ability of your neighbours to enjoy their own backyard. So that's my list. And one of the things I want to do today in this first meeting is to make sure that we have a comprehensive list, and that then we work down through it and actually look at the way in which we are addressing it. Now, something like parking, we're going to see tonight, that's being addressed. We don't have to deal anymore with that one other than to know it's there. But there are many others that are not yet being dealt with that we do need to think about how we deal with them properly. So my thoughts on how to proceed with this ad hoc committee were that we would have this initial meeting and we would catalogue the issues and understand how and if these issues are currently being addressed. So, like I said, parking, we'd say it's an issue, it's being addressed. We don't need to do more than that. We know it's underway. Then to think about a period of research, probably I'm thinking of a month, so between now and the next meeting, where we as individual councillors, but aided very much by staff, and also by hopefully some input from our community, that we'll begin to understand the issues and the consequences thereof. A second meeting would be probably in February, where we would share and establish that mutual understanding and discuss potential approaches. For example, it might be a change to a bylaw, it might be a new bylaw, it might be a revision to a policy, it might be something completely off my radar screen at the moment. And then I think we need to have a period of testing what we think are the right approaches with key stakeholders, which would include a council, of course, staff, other groups in the community that would have an input. And in an ideal world, a third meeting, we would agree the analysis, the recommendations to move forward, and prepare the essence of a presentation to the Policy Development and Strategic Direction Committee sometime, probably March, maybe April. Fine-tune the recommendations, and then basically we pass the burden across to staff to develop or draft or revise bylaws, change planning policies and standards. So that's where I think we would be going. So today, it's going to be a very informal meeting. I have no intention of being rigorous about the structure of our meeting. I think if we go back to the agenda, it was to discuss the terms of reference. Now, does anybody have a different perspective on those terms of reference? Am I laying out something that you thought you weren't going to do? Or do you think this is the right way forward? And I think it's a good time now to try and agree on, get a consensus on how we should go forward. So I'll open the floor to those that wish to speak. Councillor Howes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just wondering if some initial conversation with the input from staff might help us narrow the list down a little bit. For example, like parking, parking has its own topic and its own committee, so this committee may not need to dive in a secondary way into that. I'm wondering if the same might be said for fireworks. And then I also wonder if, you know, the pride in ownership or maintenance or litter and all that stuff. There's a property standards bylaw which might encompass that, or you know, and then just the one other one is number 12. I'm not sure how far we can go in terms of determining what's an appropriate retail facility. Like, I understand that the practicality of everyone wants to see a grocery store off of Breast Acres Road, but our job is to determine where there's commercial land availability, and I'm not sure how much we can drill down to saying, and it has to be this type of retailer. So that's just a couple of initial thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. All good thoughts. Appreciate that. John McAlpine.
I guess one of the challenges I have is what you're getting at, is sort of defining what this committee was going to do. And I thought initially what we were looking at was something very simple, was just the backyards and structures and you know, talking about the play structures or whatever that was going to go in the backyard, and what's the limitations and stuff on that line. And this is, yeah, extended on a lot further. It's all interesting stuff, but it is a very large scope of what we're working, which concerns me a little bit. Practically, what can we do to?
Yeah, if it's a fair comment, John. When Councillor Chambers suggested we go this route, he did kind of set it out as, he didn't specifically say it's about backyard structures, and in many respects I'm very pleased he didn't, because it does force us to think about the issues that I believe as a council should be thinking about. This, I think, is one of the key roles of council, to look forward, see the issues that are coming and address them. And on occasion we have to do some retrospective action. We have to deal with things where the boat has already sailed, and all we can do is mitigate some of the issues. And we'll see that tonight when it comes to the parking story, that there are things that we should have done 10, 15, 20 years ago, but now we're limited in what we can do, and we're sort of looking for small improvements. But I think it would be remiss of us as a council not to reflect on the rapid growth of Paris, and in particular in respect of St. George. There's a wonderful opportunity to get it better, get it more right than we did in Paris. And I think your constituents would be pleased if we did that. So a lot of what, taking up what Councillor House said, there's an awful lot on this list of mine that is already work in progress. And so we can tick them off, and we might get down to a distilled list, which will be somewhat smaller. That said, there may be things that you or staff would come forward with and say, actually, you need to add this to your list. We may find when we talk to our residents, they say, but you haven't thought about that as well. And so I don't want to constrain the focus, but equally I don't want to spend the next 4 years doing this. I want to do it in the next 4 months, not the next 4 years. So when you see us expanding scope unnecessarily, and you think it's already being addressed elsewhere, just call it, and then we'll narrow the scope. Christine?
Yeah, if I may, one of the things that I've been reflecting on as a new counselor, going through this process, and I came out of bigger organizations within the broader public sector where strategic planning was a focus, and we do have strategic planning documents at the county. What struck me when Councillor Kyle and I were discussing the swimming pool enclosure bylaw was that actually intersected in some ways with the work of this committee, insofar as what we saw. If you had an urban backyard, chances are you already had a fence that was compliant with the proposed new regulations. You might only have to change out your gate hardware. If you were in a rural community, you might not have a fence at all. And that a lot of these conversations, I think, have to start at that kind of big picture. And so I do take John's point, because I'm sensitive that, particularly wearing the rural hat here, we may quickly creep beyond the initial mandate. But I think we have to have those big picture conversations, and even if this isn't the right place for them and we have to put them on the parking lot, I think that's worth talking about. And I wonder if I can add a few things to John's list as well there.
Please do.
As far as so building on property standards, and there was a candidate in Paris who ran with pollinator-friendly landscaping in mind. I think often that bumps up against current property standards and leads to enforcement challenges depending on your zoning. Being in the landscape and retail nursery trade, we see a lot of requests from folks who want to plant native species, which tend to get quite large. So I think we want to think about what goes in line with contemporary approaches, and the pressure for pollinators, and that ways to balance that in an urban environment, because you can't plant your boulevard that may or may not jive with property standards and safety, but finding a way to do things constructively. Brought to my attention today by a constituent out in the east part of the county, Hamilton has moved forward with Airbnb regulations, the short-term rentals and the recreation-based rentals, and I'm not sure if we have had that conversation, and if so, where we stand. But I can see if it's not an issue already, having read the media coverage, we're probably not far off from it hitting our areas. And the other piece speaking to it fits with the grocery stores, but also the school capacity and some of those broader services. And when do we need to loop in third parties as we're thinking more down the road about development and what we can do to encourage? Because I do take Councillor Bell's point about folks having to commute to get groceries contributing to our traffic challenges. So just sort of some initial thoughts there.
Thank you. I think you're going to have to give us some education in pollinators, but that'll keep that. I can talk about Airbnb because in the past I've had conversations with bylaw on this. We do have a bylaw. In fact, we just had reason in the last few months to ask our bylaw enforcement officers to go to a couple of locations and remind people that they shouldn't be running Airbnbs. They were in breach of our rule set. School capacity, and it's interesting that I think, Steve, you were talking with I think it was you talking with one of your residents about school capacity. It's not directly our bailiwick, it's not our responsibility, but I think our residents expect that we understand what's going on, that we are looking forward to the needs of the community. And maybe, Steve, you want to add your thoughts on that?
Just that this week the Grand Erie District School Board is having an open house meeting related to the north end of Paris and kind of, I think, some capacity issues. And I was promoting on social media that I was happy to see it because it's something that I know I've been asked about many times. And people think we are very involved in determining how big the schools are and where they are and when they're built, and while it's really nothing to do with us, however, it is our responsibility to be delivering some forecasts of population growth and locations to those school boards. But there's some, I think there's some information, education to the public that's possible there. Just the one other thing I was going to mention as a bit of an aside to the overall list, and I like the Airbnb topic. So for 20 years, I've had the good fortune in my day job of dealing with the area just west and north of Toronto with all of their residential growth and the number of playgrounds that they're putting in to their municipalities. So Bradford, Innisfil, Acton, like Halton Hills, Caledon, Milton, that's been my territory for the last 20 years, and it's been great because we sold a lot of playgrounds. It just springs to mind, though, that I think every topic on our list has been traversed by these municipalities, and we do attend these conferences. Representation from the County of Brant attends these different conferences, and I know that our staff are part of associations where there's dialogue. So I'm optimistic that there are good and bad lessons to be learned by the people who got hit by the wave before we did. Because I think you nailed it right at the beginning when you said, Milton, Halton Hills, Oakville, Burlington, this whole area did get hit with this wave 10 years ago. And I'm sure if we can figure out the right way to mine into those experiences, we could see some good and bad lessons.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, any comments you want to make at this point? He's deep in thought.
Well, I'm trying to choose my words correctly. I feel that this is a bitch list of all the things that are bothering you and maybe other councillors. I think that everything here has a place to be discussed and to resolve, but it's not in a meeting like this. I'm finding this meeting very uncomfortable. I don't understand really the concept of this meeting or what we plan to achieve in this meeting. Because everything on this list has a place to talk about it. It's not here, it's not right now. I understand exactly what you're saying about you wish things were different, but these, Councillor Bell, are all the things that are bothering you or that you want changed or you want altered. And as much as I agree with some of them, I mean, I don't agree with all of them, but I think that there's a place. And that's why we have all the different committees where we talk about all these things. And there'll be a chance for us to, we've talked about firecrackers, we've talked about parking, we've talked about bylaw enforcement, we've certainly talked about backyard chickens. And everything else has a place to be talked about. I don't understand, unless you're planning on bringing recommendations from this committee back to the other committee, which again goes to council. So I'm not sure why we're here, and I'm not sure what you're hoping to get out of this. And I don't want to appear ridiculously stupid, but I don't get it.
Okay, well, I'll try one more time. I mean, the whole thing was prompted by the conversation about the 14.5-foot fence poles. And I saw that as a singular issue that we could resolve in that particular body of council. And it was pointed out to me we couldn't. And the proposal brought forward by Councillor Chambers was to recognise that this is a consequence of intensification in our community. And he opened up the opportunity then to address other issues. It's not my bitch list by any means. It is meant to be a summary of the things I've observed in 4 years in council, in following social media in the community pretty closely. So maybe people in the community are bitching about it, and that's true. But the reality of it is that we are the leaders of the community, and I think we need to be comfortable that we have covered off everything. And maybe at the end of this meeting we'll say 13 out of 14 of these are already covered, and we can find a way of dealing with number 14. And that's really what I want to be sure of, that we're not missing out. I don't want to look back in 4 years' time and say, well, we should have thought about that back in 2022 or 2023, as we should have thought about some of these things back in 2010 or 2005, when studies of Southwest Paris were done, or studies of North Paris were done. We don't seem to have the vehicle today in our council committee structure to have this kind of conversation. We run on quickly to dealing with the here and now. We tend to deal with problems as they arise, rather than trying to identify problems before they arise or as they are arising, and coming forward with progressive solutions. So if I'm making you uncomfortable, Mr. Mayor, that's probably where I want you to be, in a sense. I want us all to feel uncomfortable that we, as the council, are looked upon as being the providers of the answers. Now, not as individually, and we don't have the skills for that, but we are meant to represent our constituents who bring forward these issues, and they're expecting us to find a way of dealing with them. And of course, we use our very capable, experienced, skilled staff to do that. So I'm more than willing to reflect at the end of this meeting whether there's sufficient meat in this to have another meeting, and if not, then I'll call it off. I'll do that. But I think it would be helpful if maybe we could have staff come and talk. Jennifer, are you willing to come up and just share your thoughts about experiences of others, and whether we are facing unique problems or problems that are being resolved by others and that we can learn from? Don't want to put you on the spot, Jennifer, but come on out. Steve.
Just before we put Jennifer on the spot, I'm just wondering, looking at a couple of different points of view that have been shared so far here today. I'm wondering, would it be worthwhile to shorten this list and to go through and say, you know, this, and this have homes in these committees, these staff departments. Here are the ones that maybe don't. But then specifically, I'm wondering if we might feel some progress if we tackled the original topic of inappropriate structures in backyards, and if we talked that through and perhaps came to some recommendations that would then go to a committee, and then move on to tackle perhaps something else from a shortened list.
Yeah, thank you. My expectation is that we will shorten this list, and that's one of the reasons we have staff here to say, you don't need to worry about item number 1 because it's being dealt with, and I know that. But I don't know whether the remainder of the items are being dealt with, and whether or not we, as council, can just kind of shrug our shoulders and say, well, you know, just let it happen. And that's what I really fear, that we just let things happen. Jennifer, I'm going to ask you again. Are you okay about coming up to talk? Come over here. No, over there. Anywhere, wherever you want to sit. Because I asked the question of Jennifer the other day. I said, you know, we can't be on our own on this. We must have an awful lot to draw from. And Jennifer said, absolutely we do. Didn't you, Jennifer?
Through you, Chair. That is correct. We can go through some of the list, because I think that you had asked policy to be here, because some of them falls on this, but we also have bylaw. We have Mark Eby, our Director of Transportation. We have legal services. We have building as well. So it's not just policy. But I think the intent was the committee that we were at, it had to do with the inappropriate structure. But at the time, staff was not asked to update the zoning bylaw at the time. And I think that that was part of the issue of what the staff asked for, and then the workload issues that may come out of this, especially in light of the direction policy planning has now to do the official plan in the next few months as well. But in terms of a couple of the items, we do have some information. It just depended on how you wanted the information presented to either the specific committee, because there are items that are being addressed at this time. Like for instance, the parking, Brandon has a very large report tonight. Whether, I think you'll get some answers. It's a very comprehensive report. Number 2, traffic management, I have to default to Mark Eby, Director of Infrastructure. But a couple of them I could just go through. Number 6, we'll call them urban chickens. But it's not, I would like to take out the word urban, because it's not just urban, it's an issue across the entire county, because they're not allowed in residential areas, and they're considered livestock, and I think that's the issue, because we're actually getting a lot of, Jessica Kitchen has also dealt with the issue this week, has to do with our zoning bylaw, and a lot of rural residential residents, and also in our rural settlements would like them, not just in the urban area, just to point that out. Inappropriate structures of back.
Sorry, Jennifer, if I may. Jessica's getting a lot of questions. How are we responding to it? Are we just saying there is a bylaw in place and that's it? Or are we assuming that we're going to review that bylaw?
Through you, Chair, we don't have enough microphones for staff, but I can answer questions. We don't have a staff liaison, but perhaps that's something the committee can also discuss if they would like, because most committees have a staff liaison associated with them, and I don't know if that's something that is the intent.
I'll go back to say I thought this was going to be a very informal committee, and it's turning out to be more formal than I expected. So the answer is I never asked for it, but I probably do need it. Yeah. Brandon, go ahead.
Yeah, shoot. Through you, the chair. I can speak to the urban chickens a little bit. So that is a bit of a zoning issue. Based on our current zoning bylaw, we only allow livestock as is defined in our agricultural zone. So there are some discrepancies with where that zone applies within rural settlements, within some of the rural residential areas. That's all something we're going to be looking at with the comprehensive review after the official plan is done. But the things that would regulate it would be the animal control, bylaw, which I don't think references chickens or livestock in that way. It kind of kicks it to that. And then the zoning. So the zoning inside the settlement areas doesn't permit the chickens. We've done a number of reports on that matter in the past, and the answer currently to residents would just be that the direction that we have right now is that the agricultural zoning allows it, but other zonings do not. And if they wished, I guess, to come forward with some more questions about it, or wanted staff to undertake some research, they could come to council and speak to council. And if council deemed that kind of a priority to look into, then we could look into it a bit further. But we are, I guess I'll just note, we're looking into it a bit with our kind of comprehensive review.
So as far as taking the mayor's challenge here, this is being dealt with. So we don't need to spend any more time. We can say comfortably that it's being managed now by staff. So number 6 can come off the list. So John?
So when you're talking about the comprehensive review that you'll be working on, what other sort of things will be coming up under that? Is it the whole laundry list?
There is a large laundry list of items that we'll be looking at with the comprehensive review of the zoning bylaw. So we're required to update our bylaw. I believe it was Bill 23 that changed this, but we're required to update the bylaw within 1 year of the new official plan being in place. We're also looking at alternatives for having a zoning bylaw. There's alternative kind of implementation mechanisms. So community planning permit system is one. It's a little broader of an approach, because some of the issues that we find we have with our zoning bylaw is the general implementation and how strict it is. It doesn't allow for the flexibility that maybe some residents are looking for. So we are looking at those kind of options as well. I'm trying to think of some off the top of my head of examples that we're looking at, but on-street parking, that we're kind of looking at those parking requirements that'll be included as part of that as well. There's landscape open space issues that we have related to the parking in front yards, so allowing people to park maybe 2 cars in the front yard, but also this goes to the idea of having enough green space and pollinators and that type of stuff in your front yard. So there's a whole kind of slew of information. I actually have a full folder of it all, so if you'd like a list, I can provide that as well.
Yeah. In order to keep this meeting as tight as I can, I'm going to take 1 off the list. I'm going to take 6 off the list. So keep going, Jennifer, find more.
Through you, Chair, so the next item I can see that relates to policy planning, the inappropriate structures in backyards. So just to follow up, and Brandon could talk a bit more about that, is when the issue came up about the structure in the south end of Paris, there's a loophole in our zoning bylaw, and I think that that's part of the issue, because it didn't fall under the fence and pool bylaw. But it's an issue that, again, I will turn over to Brandon, because it's a loophole that could be addressed by housekeeping.
And that's correct, through the chair. So that is kind of a particular loophole in the zoning bylaw. So the zoning bylaw is very vague about how it controls or regulates accessory structures in urban areas. So an accessory structure can kind of be anything. The definition is a bit broad. That's something we've put on our list to look at with the comprehensive review. So that may be larger structures like that. We're trying to keep them away from the property lines. We can regulate them more that way. There's lots of different options for that, but that is on the list to be looked at with the zoning bylaw review. It's just that the loophole exists right now, and if the person's built it, and it's something that they've legally established or lawfully established, then they enter into that legal non-conforming situation.
So give me a timeline on that again.
So the comprehensive bylaw will need to be done within 1 year of the official plan, which we're aiming for, I think, May adoption right now. So May 2024 would be worst case scenario.
So is it possible to bring it forward, because this was where the whole issue emanated from? Is it possible to have that dealt with ahead of the comprehensive zoning bylaw update?
There may be some staffing, maybe resource issues we have to discuss a bit further, but it's something we could report on. I think there are a few things on the list that may be worth some consideration for changes in the zoning bylaw. The only thing I think I would caution is that if we're going and changing the zoning bylaw now in the next 6, 8, 10 months, and then we get rid of the zoning bylaw in 12 months, it can be a bit of a duplication of work, a redundancy of work. But if that's a direction that council would like, maybe even just specific to that issue, It's not a lot of work just to write a zoning bylaw amendment for one particular item.
Yeah.
I would say just be careful of the scope of the work. So that would be my caution.
I probably need a bit of guidance from the clerk, because I found myself chairing this meeting because I tried to do exactly what Brandon is suggesting we try and do, but was told I couldn't. So what's the vehicle that we should use to give Brandon direction? We can't pass a bylaw in. I was told we can't pass a bylaw in council if I bring it forward. But how do I get that bylaw onto the floor?
So through you, Mr. Chair, what mechanism we can do primarily for this committee will be staff direction. So we can direct Brandon to research the bylaw and its accompanying amendments that might be needed for this particular item. And then we'll have his research come back to this committee in the form of a staff report.
Okay, thank you. So, and then we would bring our report to council.
Yes.
Yeah. So would anybody care to make that a motion, just to make sure we get it moved forward?
Would part of this maybe is preliminary work with what we're doing in a sense for the comprehensive review. And maybe what we're looking at, and I think this is maybe what you're looking at, is coming up with more of a conversation, okay? Because I think I know where you're coming from in a sense, and bear with me as I work through this. As counselors, a lot of the time we're being reactive to what staff is coming forward with, right? And I think to what degree what you're trying to be is proactive, okay? And so just trying to figure out, okay, what are the things, like some of the things we've listed, and just making sure they are on the list for this comprehensive review. It's the same problem we came up with this morning with Jody in this, being aware of staff time and making sure that we're be diligent, that we're utilizing it as best as possible. Yeah, this is a lot more than I expected to. Like when we started out, I thought it would be maybe the four of us sit down at a table and write down some ideas, see where they are, then maybe sit down with staff to see if they're already being, looked at in the future, sort of what timelines are things being done. We're at the first stage of a new council, some of the things Christine's going to bring up and some of the new councillors are things that have already been looked at in the past, the chickens, hens, but then somebody like Jennifer comes from a totally different viewpoint where she brings in a lot more into the conversation with her work within the agricultural field, right? And I think, so I think I know where you're coming from to a degree, and it's just.
Jyoti, would you like to say something?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to kind of echo the comments that I think I heard Councillor Howes and the Mayor indicate earlier about these topics being in a particular home committee. The only concern I just raised is if you're dealing with things like an amendment to the zoning bylaw, which this committee then directs staff to do, and then that report comes back to this committee, and then the recommendation goes straight to council, then you have bypassed the planning and development committee, where normally the issues of zoning bylaw amendments are addressed. It's that disconnect, and there might be some issues associated with process on that. So I just raised that. I don't want to get into any legal advice on that because we are in public session. So I just raised that. I think that's what the mayor was alluding to originally. And if I could just finish my one thought. The other is that when there is a decision, it can also be appealed to the OLT. So if you're going to ask Brandon, as a hypothetical, to do a site-specific amendment to the zoning bylaw to deal with one specific issue, and then that's appealed, that might tie up that issue until the appeal is resolved. You might have actually gotten further had you just waited until the comprehensive bylaw was done after the OP. So some of the timelines just need to be looked at.
Yeah, thank you, Jyoti. I do feel like I'm getting the procedural runaround on this issue. It really does. You know, it's started from something very simple, very transparent, very obvious, that our community reacted to pretty strongly. And it could happen in any community in Paris or outside of Paris for that matter. So I don't want to, I think our residents are expecting us to be able to react in a timely way to issues and to push this away till what might be the end of next year. I'd be uncomfortable with it, but I cannot make that motion. So if nobody wants to make the motion, then it will die on the floor anyway. So Steve, and then Christine, and then Steve.
Yeah,
Steve and then Christine.
Big picture here. When you were asking about the motion, my first reaction was, wouldn't it be quicker ultimately to deal with this at planning? And that's like, and I know what you're saying, and you feel like you're getting the runaround, but I think when you look at this list of 14 items and a couple other items that might be added, rather than being consequences of urban intensification, I think they fall under a bigger melting pot of kind of brainstorming the future of our community. And that ideally is a coffee conversation between some counselors, and doesn't necessarily involve hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of staff sitting around the room, which is a little bit significant. I'm just wondering if a lot of these items have homes in our current procedure, but that as council we need to have some informal conversations about steering our future.
Well, you know my view on that. It's something we should do. It's something that I think is missing from the structure we have in our council. That we don't have the ability to have these kind of conversations, except maybe if it becomes a strategic plan process that we're following through, or an official plan processing that we're following through. Our colleagues in the city, at the beginning of each term, they have a sit down and they talk about the priorities that they're going to deal with in the next 4 years. So I would encourage that, and I've mentioned that to the mayor. It's no surprise to him. But at the same time, what you're suggesting is actually what we're trying to do. We're trying to work down this list and find a home for everything. Item number 7 has no home directly in things that are already ongoing. So what I'm asking is that we find the proper procedural way to give it a home with a consciousness of the timeline that we put on it. And there is a clear way to say, well, we'll deal with it in the comprehensive zoning bylaw, but as Brandon points out, that might be the end of next year. Who knows? And I think that would be inappropriate given that the issue was raised, and we're going to move into another summer season coming shortly. I don't want to find out that the mayor and I get 1,000 phone calls from the people in the next street down that decide to put 14.5-foot posts up to put a zip line in. I really don't want that, and I think none of us should want that. So I would encourage, and that's as much as I can do as the chair, that we pass a motion that gives direction to staff to move this thing forward independent of the comprehensive bylaw update. Of course, it will get caught up in that, and that's where we start from. I've done one of these before when I was working in the it was actually the Economic Development Advisory Committee. We helped with the last comprehensive zoning bylaw update. So you don't start from a blank piece of paper, you start from what you have, and you get a red pen out and you change things, and you get a green pen out and you amend things. So if there's not support to push this thing forward, fine, I accept that. That's the way we do business here. But I would feel discouraged if we whittle away at this and say, well, there's actually nothing to do, when in fact there is something very big to do. And that's for us to do what you suggested, Stephen. That's to somehow take an overarching view of what we're trying to achieve as a council and as leaders of the community. And this is just one very tiny piece of it. So
So, can staff speak again to, like, I think we know what Councillor Bell's trying to achieve, and specific to this issue. And I think staff knows the solution. Can you speak a little further to the most efficient and timely way for us to get there?
Through the chair to Councillor House before Brandon speaks. Just in terms of a procedural matter, like as our legal counsel has indicated in terms of any Planning Act changes, and I think that's a bit of the disconnect, is there are certain topics that come up at Planning Committee that don't get resolved or other issues, but there's not any further direction to staff to undertake different projects. And in terms of all the projects that get slotted in, especially say for policy planning right now, we were directed last Tuesday to complete an official plan, and then everything else gets slotted in to our timeline, and then the OP just starts moving farther ahead in the schedule. But in terms of procedure, and I think that's where I think clerks and legal need to talk about the actual procedure about directing staff through an ad hoc committee up to do certain various projects to look at, because some of them are actually on this list already underway. And I think that a lot of councillors always reach out to us, and we have good relationships on staff. Whenever you need any type of information, you always ask, because some of these things we already know about, like retail grocery stores. We're working with 2 big corporations already in town for a store in the Southwest site. We already are working with the Catholic School Board and Grandview School Board for the North End. So it's just that we don't have 100% details at the moment, but those discussions are always ongoing. So it's those details that we have, it's just that there's nothing concrete about those things. So if you direct staff to provide information to council to keep you guys in the know, if constituents ask, we're always available. But I think the update of projects and procedures need to be slotted in with our interim CAO and senior management, and then following a certain procedure, especially if you're asking us to update the Planning Act pieces to avoid appeals, because we seem to be getting appealed a lot.
well,
But I'll turn it over to Brandon if he has some additional words on that specific matter.
Through the chair, I think the only thing I would add is if this is this matter is particular to one property right now, or a couple, we have to remember as well that changing the zoning bylaw is not retroactive. I know we do want to move forward with that. So the way that we look at it from the zoning perspective, from a planning perspective, we try and look at it for the greater good of the community. And if we've had a few people complain about one thing comparative to the 49,000 other people in the county of Brant, it's my job, it's our job to balance how that is implemented through the zoning bylaw. And that's why we slot some of these things into comprehensive reviews, like housekeeping, and some of them get that particular attention. So I would just suggest that maybe if there is direction to be given, that it considers that. As Jen mentioned, we have quite a few large projects moving forward, and I'd hate to see some of those large projects be thrown to the side for a zip line, of that matter, with all due respect.
Thank you. I'll let Councillor Garneau come in, and I'm going to make a couple of comments to that point.
I'm going to actually try and take us back a bit to the big picture here, and forgive me, my notes have gone in several different directions here. I think we have to step back from the outcomes, and when I put my former governance professional hat on here, what I see is things that are bigger picture conversations that need to be had. We're intersecting between committee mandates, and what I'm increasingly learning in the municipal sector, I'm reminded that Robert's Rules is a way to dispense with business and not a deliberative procedure that we're normally under, which tends to prohibit us from having these sorts of bigger picture open discussions without a predetermined outcome. And I guess I'm sort of challenging John on, I know you've got an idea, and I think we have to figure out how we get there, but I think we also maybe do need to throw some things at the wall and because of our open and transparent municipal government, what we've already heard from staff is it has to be on the record. I find it very uneasy as a new counselor with the coffee meetings that happen, because I think in some ways that goes against the principles that we are intended to operate under. And although I really don't want to hear the gendered word used, the list that we're discussing right now, again, I think the reason that these things are on today's list is because they're important to the public. And if there's anything I learned from my own campaign too that I sort of already had an idea about, the public don't necessarily know how to raise something. So they come to the counselor, they come to staff, and there's frustration about all these different processes going on. And I can see down the road in this process, if we continue with this committee and think less about maybe what the outcomes are, but more that there's conversations that need to be had that might actually inform staff work plans for the better. It's just we're dealing with issues that I think don't have homes, but some of them do, but they also bump up against other pieces. And I'm struggling with how we advance that from a governance standpoint, but I think we need to have the conversation within the parameters that we, broadly speaking, in municipal government have to work within. And I suspect that takes things back to the clerk's office and council. But I think it's worth reflecting more on the what do we need to talk about, and then figuring out how do we get there, and does it fit into an existing process. Yeah, just sort of some random thoughts, because when I hear things are in the works, and I know Allison and Melissa's team's not here today represented, it sounds like some of the things that we hear from constituents, if we had a different communications approach, folks, the public, might go about differently. So sorry, just some random musings. I don't know where we go from here, but they're my thoughts.
Thank you. Just to go back to, I think the issue, looking at number 7 here. Number 1 on this list was an issue back in September, 27th, I think it was, Brandon. And we went through a process and said we direct staff to do a review and come forward with proposals. And you've come forward with actually proposed zoning bylaw changes, but they won't be retroactive, of course. I don't expect this one to be, I don't expect in relation to number 7 for it to be retroactive. But at the same time, if we just take a look around us, we are building more and more properties of even smaller dimensions with smaller yards, where the potential for this thing to be more explosive than it was, which it affected 6 or 7 homes. But a lot more than 6 or 7 people saw it, and that is something that my expectation is we will see it come forward again. And so whilst we could leave this till the comprehensive zoning bylaw, I don't think there's anything lost in scheduling it to, for example, to be done once the OP is signed off and in the hands of the minister, which puts us perhaps to the middle of this year rather than the middle of next year. So that would be a compromise solution that I could suggest. And if somebody were to make the motion that we direct staff to do this, then I can take number 7 off the list as well. And if nobody makes that motion, then it's going to stay on the list. That's a simple answer. We will be talking about it for some time more. Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Bell, the other thing that has me a little bit feeling kind of strange about this meeting is that we don't represent council. We are ad hoc. So everything we decide or everything we talk about and think about today is not a council decision I mean, when you said you want any ad hoc committee I've ever sat on, was very casual. And again, didn't involve tying up staff. We talk about it, we bring back recommendations to council as an ad hoc committee. And that's the way that goes. But we don't represent council here. We only represent ourselves. And you've got someone from each ward and the mayor. And I don't understand how you would think that we could bring something back representing council, or it's a step too much. We've put one step too many in here, trying to get back to a place that we weren't comfortable with to begin with. And it's very confusing.
Well, nobody's more confused than I am. because I was told that this is the route to follow. And council all approved this, and they approved that we should address this issue. I understand fully that whatever we decide has to go back to council for sign-off. So I'm not suggesting that anything we agree today is a done deal, but it will reflect, I hope, the views of this ad hoc committee. And if it doesn't, then we can't bring it forward. But we are going to have an unresolved issue lingering around. So I don't think there's a different process other than this subcommittee saying that's what we'd like to do. We make a recommendation to council. Council could say yes or no. If they say no, that's it. It's done. It's over. And I accept that. I'm not going to try and fight that particular issue.
I just think everything on your list, we could go back and fight harder at every committee. We could go back to where it belongs, put them back where they belong, and just keep fighting for them.
Well, and part of the exercise was to make sure that we did have comprehensive coverage of all of these issues. And one of the things that we can report back is we can feel comfortable. All of these issues are getting addressed. This one isn't, just as an example. It's not being addressed by anybody at the moment. It was addressed by forming this ad hoc committee. But I don't want to go around and disappear at my own backside on this one, because that's where I, in a sense, I feel like I'm going, just spiraling back to a place that I started from. So I don't know whether other people feel the same, but if we work through this list and we will say everything's got a home, apart from number 7 at the moment, then this will be the last meeting in this ad hoc committee.
I think, Councillor Bell, too, maybe not everyone knows everything that everyone else knows. Like, I knew there was going to be some grocery stores where they're going to be. I don't know what they're going to be. I know where they're going to be, but I don't know the names of them. But some of the things that you were concerned about, I mean, I think the public needs to know that we have nothing to do with school boards other than recommend, with our population data, where they should be and when they should come up. But the school board's never been a part of municipal politics. It's a separate piece. And at some point, the public needs to take responsibility for knowing things. And whether that's through us, through putting something in the paper, or I don't know, just putting it on our social media, or however people have to, wherever people learn things, they should just know that. And once they know that it's not up to us to explain why there's 12 portables at the high school. That's not poor planning at a county level. That is poor planning at a school board level. So at some point, the public have to take responsibility for knowing some things on their own. And some of the things that are on your list don't make sense to people, and that's why they question them. Like not having chickens or hens in the county when you can have them in the city. Say no more, just stop there. It doesn't make any sense. You can have chickens downtown on Coburn Street in Brantford. That's their business. We have our business. Now, we can modify that. We can play with that and toss it around. Maybe we will have chickens. Maybe heritage houses can have peacocks. We haven't defined. We haven't taken things and sort of massaged it, made it work for the county. These are things that when you look at them don't make any sense. Some of the things on the list. But I do believe, and how do you control fireworks? I mean, by the time a fireworks is, and you hear a noise and it's bothering someone, tonight's council meeting is exactly the same. There's a man here trying to tell us tonight not to have CN trains blow their horns in Paris. I mean, things are crazy, Councillor Bell, and people think differently when they don't understand. They need to come and understand the process to understand the results. And I think some of these things we just have to take back to where they belong and fight for them. If we're not comfortable, we'll fight for them.
A couple of thoughts, Mr. Mayor. Schools. It's almost a daily occurrence that I receive a message from somebody saying, where should I send my kids to school? I've just moved to Paris. So, yes, it's their responsibility. But there is an issue that exists, and as leaders of the community, I feel like it's our obligation to try and help people understand where to go. Not for us to solve the problem of a school being not big enough or not, but there's so much more, and I think Councillor Garneau mentioned it. Communication is such an important issue here, that a lot of these things come up and land on our table inappropriately, but because nobody knows where else to put them. So one of our challenges, and maybe that's actually item number 18 on this list, is that we need to step up our communication to address these issues so they don't come back to us as a request for us to solve them.
But on my desk, Councillor Bell, is numbers of the Grand Erie School Board and the Catholic School Board. And you can phone Greg Anderson or you can phone Mr. Petrella. And I have that information that when people call me and say, we're new to the county and we're looking for a Catholic school and we just bought in the North End or the South End, I give them those numbers because that's where it goes after me.
And that's exactly what I do, but it's just the frequency with which it occurs tells me that this is not just a one-off question. This is a regular question that I get. So just before you continue on, Steve, fireworks, you may or may not recall, Mr. Mayor, that we did have, and Greg will remember, we did have a fireworks bylaw brought to us. And at the core of that was a limitation on where you could have fireworks, and it was limited to the dimensions of the rear yard of the property. So in that respect, very akin to the issue that we're looking at in number 7 in this list. Now, you say it's not our business. Well, why do we have a bylaw anyway, then, if that's not our business? But I think it is appropriate that we take a lead in this one because it is a safety issue. And, I don't know when the bylaw is coming back. I was going to get to that after this one. But we do have to recognise there are issues that people would think, they're not council issues, but they end up on the council table because they don't end up anywhere else, and fireworks is one of them.
And Councillor Bell, I think our bylaws are very liquid. They need to be liquid because we put what 3 dates to fireworks, which are, I don't know, Canada Day, 24th of May or something. Now what happens when the Sikhs call us and when the Muslims call us and they bring forward their festival, which includes fireworks, and we say, well, we only allow fireworks. We're a very inclusive community. We're very diverse. We're very welcoming. But unless your festival falls on Canada Day, you don't fit into our bylaw. So whether you're complaining about the size of the backyard, the bylaw doesn't work in many other ways. We have a population that are coming here to celebrate many other festivals and dates with fireworks that are very important to them that aren't on our 3 days that we just modified our bylaw for. So I don't think your list is very good. I don't think it's very, I don't think it's the right list. I think we all should have been prepared to bring a list today if this is the way you were going to do it. But I don't believe you thought this was the way we were going to do it.
No, Mr. Mayor, I'm sorry. I brought this list as a starter list. And my question to you all was, are there things to add to it? And Councillor Garner mentioned 3 more things, just as an example. I haven't heard anything from other members of the group. In fact, the direction from John was he thought we should only have 1 thing on the list. So it illustrates, to my mind, that there are issues which we don't actually get to grips with collectively. There are issues which are governed by our bylaws, which we seem to forget. There are issues that we should have on our list, we haven't got on the list. I'd like to bring us back to item 7 and the issue. This could be almost the end of the conversation if that's what you want. I came here because I got frustrated with an inability to use the procedural rules that we have to bring forward a bylaw proposal, which could have been voted down on the spot. People could have said, forget it. But that wasn't the way it worked out. The way it worked out was we were directed to form an ad hoc committee to address the issues of urban intensification. Not specifically that one, and that's why there's a list of 14 expanded to 16 or 17 or 18. And you could expand it, Mr. Mayor, to 25 because you probably have other ideas. But we still have, I want to try and keep the pace on this one. I'd like to deal with number 7 and then we can move on. I'll let Steve ask a question and then we'll move on from that.
Thanks. I think when I put this in my agenda, I called it backyard meeting because I thought we were going to be discussing some of the factors related to what how we're going to try and steer what can and can't be done in your backyard. And that was one of the reasons why it was suggested that I be part of this AdHoc committee, just because of some experience and related to playgrounds and stuff. I think we need to burn through your list with all the staff that are sitting here and just say, traffic, which committee does that fall under? Fireworks, which committee does that fall under? Because both the issue of the size of the backyards and Diwali were both discussed when fireworks came on our agenda at committee, right? It did have a home, and I think safety on streets and some of I think we could burn through this list and just narrow down for our own peace of mind which house they lived in, and then just lastly, ironically, I've been on council the same amount of time that you have and the same amount of time that the mayor has. I've never had one constituent call me and ask me what school their kid should go to. And it just shows that we have different experiences as councilors, and the experiences of individual councilors doesn't necessarily dictate what an AdHoc committee should be focusing on.
I absolutely agree. I gave a list that we would debate whether it had merit or not. Are you telling me I shouldn't bring a list? But Councillor Garner, you have a go.
Sorry. So if I go back to our terms of reference, and this links into our next steps here, we're to review the bylaws, plans, and policies and identify the concerns. And I think we're doing just that right now. Our mandate is, although I've colloquially called it the backyard committee as well, our mandate is actually broader as written from council here. And we're to report back on what the concerns were and what we think might be done about them. So if we take that, then I think the spitballing and the laundry list is actually where we're supposed to be with our direction from council. And if we feel that this is not what we're supposed to be doing as an AdHoc committee, I think we actually have to go back to council for our terms of reference. Because our task was actually to come up with the list and the ideas with some potential solutions, but not actually to be funneling things off to the other committees. So I'm almost seeing a spreadsheet here. Sorry, I feel like I'm being a process person rather than necessarily a substantive contributor, but if that moves us forward in a way that gets everybody back on the same page, maybe this is kind of how we go, because absolutely there are things that are in the works, but we might also find through this conversation or our public consultations that there are more things that can feed into those other processes that we might not have heard about at the right stage in the process to affect that change. So I'm not sure if I'm trying to advance our conversation here because I know there's some competing viewpoints about what we're supposed to be doing. So if we go back to our council mandate, yeah.
So I'm going to try and press through on this list, and I'm stuck at number 7. And we can discharge this one as we discharge number 1 and number 6 by making a recommendation from this committee, a direction to staff that they look at this particular bylaw and come forward with an answer in middle of the year, and then it's done. But if we don't, the issue remains unresolved. So I can't make motions from the chair. That's one of the things I learned from Robert's rules. Steve.
I will move that this committee requests that staff bring back a revised approach to that issue in as timely a fashion as possible.
Thank you. Do I have a seconder? Without a seconder, the motion can't come to the floor. Without a motion on the floor, the issue remains unresolved.
For conversation, I guess.
Thank you. All right. Would anybody like to speak to that motion? If not, then I'll call the vote. All those in favour.
Sorry, John. Can I clarify?
Yeah.
We're voting with regards to the specific number 7 to refer that to staff. Okay.
To some degree, I thought that was kind of the idea of this committee, is to look at structures in the backyard and involve, I guess, staff in that conversation.
I feel like perhaps we weren't clear on what we voted on at admin and operations and council, and that's
think so.
created
I'm just asking Brian to pull up what was said in council.
because the terms of reference seem to align with what Councillor Chambers proposed. But if we weren't clear on it in the moment, we have to go a few steps back in governance, right? I don't want to overstep Briar there, but it seems that we're.
While Briar is looking that up, in response to the discussion of the topic that's on the floor, I think staff has come back to us today and reported that they have details that maybe did not exist at the time of that meeting, that will result in a solution, leaning on an issue actually that was a topic you had brought up about distances away from property lines and things like that, which would actually make your zip line go away, at least the part that's attached to the fence post. I think there's, I think staff is telling us that they have a way of remedying that situation.
Yeah, I'm going to read what was in the minutes. It says, and this is in regard of unintended consequences of urban intensification, that it be recommended to council to create an ad hoc committee of council with, but not limited to, I'll read that again, with, but not limited to, the following terms of reference: to review all applicable bylaws, plans and policies and identify concerns related to the unintended consequences of urban intensification. It wasn't specifically about backyards.
Mm-hmm.
To report these concerns with recommendations on how to address them to council no later than June 2023, with interim reports to the committee's discretion, at the committee's discretion. I think I'm trying to follow through on that brief. Now, you collectively or some individually may have not have appreciated that, but that's what we agreed. We all put our hands up in that particular that committee meeting of council and agreed it. So I'm a little disappointed that we're having this conversation, because I feel like I'm following through on exactly what we were asked to do, and what I think is the right thing to do, by the way, not just what we're asked to do, because that particular issue of structures in the backyards was just one example, and I gave, I think, 4 or 5 different examples when I talked to it at council, and we ended up in this place. I was very specific. I just wanted to solve that one problem, but I was told, no, you go about it a different way. And this is my sense of going around in circles at the moment. So before I go back round the circle again, we do have a motion on the floor. It is proposed and it's seconded. I'm open to discussion on the motion, and if there's no more discussion on the motion, I'll call the vote.
So
John, you wish to speak to the motion?
So referencing back to staff again, so I understand staff of the process, and is it in place and going forward at this point, or are you seeking direction from the committee, or?
Through the chair, I think staff, with the help of council, has identified that there is a gap, that there's an issue with respect to this particular issue, and staff are already working on potential in a formalized project.
Yeah, and I think and this goes back to what Dave was saying too, is that it's sort of like the grocery stores, and there's people are working on it in the background, and challenges, and this goes sort of like what I've talked about. What I've really appreciated over the last 6 months, okay, is the side conversations we have with staff and people to find out sort of what staff are thinking about, what's going on in the background, what's being worked on. And maybe what you're trying to do is formalize that to a degree.
I'm trying to carry out the terms of reference of the that we agreed to as council back in December, and that's my list is is long. It's not, I'm sure it's not comprehensive. It's certainly long, but there are, I want to try. I've taken guidance from this committee and said, look, many of these things we can say are being dealt with, and I can take comfort from that. We can all take comfort from it. Where we find there isn't staff action with a definitive end product, then I think it's our job to close that gap, and that's what I'm trying to do on item 7. Steve, you wish to speak, and then the
Just
mayor.
point of order in that we're off the topic of the motion.
We are off the topic of the motion.
And I think after this motion is settled one way or the other, we can discuss whether the validity of the list.
Which,
and that might get us closer to common ground, but I think we need to get back to the motion.
okay. Do you want to speak to the motion, Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
Yep.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to staff. So even if you have come up with something that's going to stop this from happening again, it's not retroactive to help those people that have the zip line in their backyard now. Is that right?
Through the chair, from the zoning perspective, that is correct. It would not be retroactive.
Thank you.
Okay, at that point, if nobody else wishes to speak to the motion, I'll call the vote. All those in favour of the motion? Those against? Motion is carried. Brandon, do you understand what we've asked you to do? Thank you. So number 7 on my list comes off. So thank you for that. Jennifer, do you want to carry on? Is there anything else from a policy perspective you see on that list that you would want to bring forward? Okay, then I'll go back to the list and open that conversation. If people want to challenge the fact that we have a list of issues that are associated with the impacts of or the consequences of urban intensification, let's hear them now. Because if you've got more to add, that's great. If you think this is not the way to do it, let's hear it. Steve.
Right, and I think the list is too broad, and I think we need to, since the staff are all sitting here anyway, I think we need to take advantage of that and just, you can run through the list, the items that haven't already been stroked off, and determine which ones have homes and which ones don't have homes, and those ones warrant our attention.
I think it's a very good suggestion. Does anybody else wish to speak to that? Because otherwise I'll follow that process directly. I'll start with number 2, traffic management. And I gave the example of Mile Hill, so that is definitely being considered. But the broader impacts of intensifying population in Paris really center themselves, actually find themselves in many areas. And we could argue that the master transportation plan is going to deal with them. But, and I think I would suggest that the timelines that we have on there are not satisfying the need that is felt by the community on these issues. Councillor House.
So I would argue that that has a solid home in the transportation master plan, and if we don't like the timeline associated to it, there's a committee in which to discuss it.
Yep, okay, I'll take that. Anybody object to that? No? Fireworks, I'm going to ask Greg if he would just tell us where we got to with the fireworks bylaw.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the report on the fireworks bylaw is coming back in February or March. We've had some additional conversations with fire. We do believe that we have a path moving forward, subject to council's decisions, but you should see a report very shortly.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask Brian just to make a note of where all these committees are that are addressing these issues, so we can, when we report back to council, they can also feel comfortable that everything is covered off. Safety on urban streets, including low speed limits, which is very clearly an issue that has occurred as we intensify our activities. If anybody wishes to speak to that, I've got some comments, but Steve, you go ahead.
And that is one that comes up all the time with constituents, but I still say it, it falls either under the Police Services Board or the Brant Safe Streets strategy, which ties to road solutions.
Anybody else wish to comment on that? Because I'll give you the example that actually triggered this in my mind, and Greg Bergeron will know about this. We had a complaint from a resident who thought he was being picked out specifically because the basketball net that he had on the side of the road was blocking a stop sign. So bylaw ticketed him. In response, that individual went around the subdivision he lived in and he identified 40 other similar situations and reported them to bylaw. And so that I don't think necessarily lands in safe streets. It is a bylaw issue, but again, it's one of those issues that is going to compound as we bring more and more homes of smaller and smaller lot size into relatively dense areas of residence. So I could say that our bylaw is addressing that, and we could close the conversation at that point, but it will keep coming back. And maybe there is a direction we need to give to bylaw to review that particular bylaw, and I'd be interested to hear from staff on that point. Great.
So yeah, this, through the chair, this bylaw is not uncommon. It's obviously to keep items off of the travel portion of the roadway or near the roadway. It's an issue that, you know, it can be a liability for the county, and I think, you know, we could probably be doing more for a public education standpoint and, you know, give people the rationale as to why they're not permitted there. I don't think the issue was so much that kids were playing basketball. The issue was where they're being stored. You know, there's been some instances where plows have hit it. There's been instances where the basketball net will fall on the street in a high wind. So there's all of these issues that the public may not be aware of. And I think we could probably, you know, relay more information. And we do have, you know, monthly blitzes that we put through social media. And moving forward, I think, you know, that's probably something we could do on a public education side.
So do we need to give direction to you, or is that already understood to be going on?
Yeah, that's understood that we're already doing that. Yeah, okay. And I can communicate with corporate communications if we need to put that out, if we're seeing problems.
Okay. Note that underway, then I'll cross number 4 off the list as being Steve.
Just a comment on that one, John. I remember that topic flamed brightly, but briefly. It was there was a weekend flurry of people upset, but then not much has been heard about it since. And I am optimistic that through bylaw and communications, there's an opportunity to clarify to people why these rules exist.
Yeah, I hope so too. But my observation is that people have not changed their behaviour, and it will come back. But I'm comfortable that we have covered that issue off, and we'll move on. The next item I had was design and sufficiency of parks and recreational facilities, and this is to me a consequence of, or a corollary to number 7. If we deny people the ability to put zip lines or big structures in their back garden, and we intensify our community, then it seems appropriate that we provide the facilities that allow children, people to go into open spaces. And I'm wanting to ask, I think this is a policy question, Jennifer, coming. Do we have guidance which is comparable to other municipalities? Are we asking for as much green space or less than or an equal amount to our neighbouring communities? And I'll give you one particular example. I mean, we have taken away a whole golf course in our community, and we have not sought in any way to replace it. We have removed a facility from our community. We have not in any way, as council, attempted to replace that. I don't believe, actually, having talked to Russell Press, that we've actually approached any commercial organisations with respect to replacing that facility. And I use that as an example, but it could be swimming pools, that as we grow the numbers of people, as we intensify our population, the demand for a swimming pool may come by. And I just wanted to know that we are on top of that in respect of population growth and intensification. Jennifer or Brandon, would you like to speak to that?
I can speak to that for a moment.
If you come to the...
Through the chair, so one of the master planning processes that's going on right now is a parks plan. It's something that we're required to do with some of the legislative changes, and that will be looking, so we're in policy planning, we're working with our parks and recreation facilities folks to have kind of a comprehensive look at parks, the styles of parks that will be introduced, or the typologies, we call them, of parks that are to be located in neighborhoods. So you have your parkettes versus your kind of community facilities, whether that be with the tennis court or something like an expansion to the Brant Sports Complex. We are looking at those things, and that will evaluate the need for that, looking at kind of our future population growth. It'll also look at kind of community engagement and seeing what the public themselves want. One thing I will note as well, so the tricky thing about the golf course example is that that's a private venture, obviously a private landowner, and while they are providing a recreational facility, it's a business, and when they sell to a developer, that becomes a development, right? So those are things we have to look at as well, to consider how that is a recreational piece that's been lost, but how the county has to evaluate what is appropriate, I guess, to provide based on that loss.
Yeah, let me just point out that our neighbouring community of Brantford had 2 municipal golf courses. It now only has 1, but they have taken the step of ensuring that there is provision for that particular community to have that facility. Steve.
Thanks. So this...
Yep, you're on.
Gary was suggesting I try tapping my mic, but anyway. Are we playing Operation? That's not helping. So this is my wheelhouse, and I'm confident that the direction we're heading in as a municipality regarding parks and parkland is consistent with what other municipalities are doing. Along the same lines, in any municipality, there's always going to be individual homeowners who decide they want to have something for their kids in their own backyard. Whether it's a trampoline or a swimming pool or a playhouse or a tire swing or whatever. Some of them are more than 8 feet tall. And that is a specific issue that came up in the
I think we dealt with item 7, Steve. We're on, this is really item 6.
Okay, yep, fair enough. Fair enough. Specific to your example about the golf course, to my knowledge, at least in my lifetime in Paris, there's never been a municipally owned golf course here. And it is a hard sell to say we've lost a commercial enterprise golf course where we hope to either create our own or inspire another commercial golf course. In this current economic world, land is just more valuable for other purposes than building golf courses. And it is unfortunate. I know I have lots of friends who golf, and everybody's still upset about that. But on the upside, from the last I spoke to that particular developer, I believe it was 40% of the land in that development is going to be green space and trails along the river. And if it wasn't such a cliff on the west side of the river leading up to the train bridge, you could almost have a trail all the way to downtown. So there is some upside within the example you chose.
Yep, thank you.
But I bottom line is I think that has a home too.
Okay. So I'm comforted by Brandon's comments that we are in the right ballpark. so to speak. And I'll move on. Oh, Christine, sorry.
If I may, on the parkland too, and I take seriously that the school boards are their own entities. I think though we also have to step back and look at what schools are used for after hours, and they also serve the same function as a lot of our municipal parks and playgrounds do in the communities, and residents don't generally see us as separate entities. We can look to models in the city of Brantford with the Branlin site, for example, that's got both school boards and Parks and Rec Community Center. There's other municipalities who work with libraries, whatnot. But I think that, you know, as much as we are, there are these jurisdictional differences. I think sometimes we have to look past them, and I can see that the provincial government is sort of challenging things here and there about assumptions and how money's spent and whatnot. But I think we'd be remiss in the conversations about parks not to also see what might be happening at the school boards, because kids just take their sports things over there. They go play on the playground after school. They ride their bikes around the parking lot. So there's sort of an added benefit there. So as much as we can say that the school board gets their numbers about planning, if we know that they're putting in a schoolyard and it's going to have certain amenities, that does also take pressure off us as the municipality to perhaps put our resources somewhere else. So I wouldn't want to see those processes move forward totally separately without that communication.
Good point. Thank you. Mr. Mayor?
And through you, Mr. Chair, just speaking to your example, the city of Brantford owned that property, and that's why it's very special that they gave back some of it. We didn't own, nor do we ever owned, just like Steve said, the golf course. And to Councillor Garneau, I'm always fighting with the school board and the principal in Glen Morris, because that when school is over in Glen Morris, the schoolyard is locked. And that is the only park they have in Glen Morris that's set out for kids. So I do, and they tell me they don't have to open it. So I'm just letting you know that some things aren't exactly what you think they would be.
Mr. Mayor, is that something you think we as council collectively should be trying to influence? And I've heard this from other people that, you know, there's a school field over there, why can't I play in it? And there is an awful lot of additional facility there that we would not have to invest in. We may be able to share the costs of maintenance, but we create a much larger playing field, so to speak, otherwise.
Mr. Chair, the answer to me from both the principal and the head of the school board is because dogs poop there.
Okay. Steve?
Yeah, I can say that in Halton region there is a joint agreement, like in Oakville, for example, and Burlington, the municipality and the school boards work together, recognizing the example that Christine mentioned, that people use it after hours, and I think it opens quite a door to significant increased costs for the municipality. I'm not sure that's something that I would recommend for us at this time in our municipal life.
Should we understand it better though? I mean, given that other municipalities do it, is there an opportunity for us to research it further and have a more considered view? I'll ask staff that.
Well, I was just going to say that we're looking into that in St. George right now, actually, with the new school and having a combination school rec center combination. So,
thank you, John. But I think we can broaden that to the many schools we have in our county. Well, again, perhaps like a direction to staff to do a little bit of research and come back and give us a more considered opinion, and pick up the very point that you mentioned, John, that you're already in conversation with respect to one particular school. But I think there are something like 20 or 30 schools in our county which all have fields. Brandon, you'd like to speak?
Sorry to interrupt. Thank you through the chair. So just so that the committee is aware, staff do have these discussions with the school board, and especially with our official plan process as well. We've been having discussions about their growth, and particularly about co-locating facilities. That is something that we know, as Councillor House has said, has happened in other municipalities. So it's kind of information we're gathering, and I think there will be a component of that that's explored through that Parks Master Plan. To look at that co-location of facilities. We do see the benefit of kind of using those spaces after hours, and even with the parking information, that was something we considered as well. Those spaces sit empty for a long period of time. So from the land use perspective, we are aware of that, and that's something we are looking into. It is on our radar.
Will you bring a report back that discusses this so that we can see the broader picture?
If that direction is received, then we could. I don't think would be me in particular, but
does this committee feel like we should direct staff to do that, because it is an important and sort of sizable facility that we could access if we could get the right arrangements? Christine?
I think respectfully it might be a little broad for our mandate to be asking too many reports of staff at this stage. I feel like we're supposed to brainstorm more. I guess I'm looking for clarification here from clerks or legal. I'm not sure who to ask the question of, but our mandate doesn't appear to be allow us to ask for much.
Let me put it in a slightly different context then. One of the consequences of intensification is that we need more green space, and there is already more green space available, but not accessible because of limitations in access arrangements. And therefore, this would be a very quick solution to creating more space.
And I don't disagree. I'm just not sure that we're following the right process to get ourselves there. That's all.
Then I
don't know.
Steve, you want to speak?
John was just, we were just talking to the side there about Parks and Rec Master Plan, and which is on the agenda tonight.
So we can address it.
There would be an opportunity to ask an appropriate question within that. Thus, that it has, reinforcing that I think it has its own home.
Yep.
Thanks, Gary. Here comes Jen. Look out.
Jen, go ahead.
Hello, through the chair. So a couple things, yeah. So tonight there's like a Parks and Recreational Master Plan update, which is more focusing on community services. But as Brandon said, we're working on the Parks Master Plan, which is mostly focused on the actual changes with Bill 109 and Bill 23. Because if you know, there's development charges changes, but then the parkland dedication bylaw itself and the percentages for new development and greenfield area development. So there's that issue. And then it actually takes our growth forecasting and where parks should be located. And as Brandon said, there's 4 major park typologies, right? There's the central park, there's a community facilities park, there's parkettes, and then there's sort of neighborhood parks as well. But those are like community facilities, mostly based on recreation amenities. In terms of natural green space, our official plan is where you need to point to. So we have actually green space policies in our new OP. We have access to green space policies. We have a 30% natural cover that we need in the county, and we are below that. That came up last year during the OP. We are not meeting that target. And then we're supposed to be 200, everyone's supposed to be 200 meters from an access to some sort of like facility for recreation or green space, because it's the ability for people's mental health and well-being. So there's those policies, and then there's actually the implementation of that in new communities. And then Bill 23 also changed the ability for some developers to actually, for acquisition and also as per parkland, because usually parkland dedication does not, it's only just the developable land. But now developers sometimes have natural areas and they're like, well, we don't know what to do with this land, but now that can actually be part of that. We're working on an unnamed development in the north end, and that is one of the things that we're working on, because say first of all, the school site itself being located next to green space, a park, and then also being accessible to the community, and these are all the new design challenges we're working on. So we've learned from the old and we're trying to take for the new, but it is a bit of growing pains, but I can assure you that it's being looked at. Perhaps that's something that you can address in new OP when we come forward, just to make sure that we've got that policy context moving forward. So I hope that helps, but if you need any further info more than that, you can let us know.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. I think the only information I'd like is as I mentioned earlier, if we could have a little bit more insight into what we could gain from accessing the facilities that currently belong to the school boards, and what steps we might take to get access, and what it would cost, what agreements we'd have to sign. I don't know whether you need direction from us for that. I think Brandon felt like he needed direction. Is there any desire on the part of the committee to give that direction? Seeing none, then we'll move on. Okay, I'm going to move on to item 9, which is potential for social disorder. And I'm going to say this in the context of something that happened a couple of weeks ago, which many of you may have seen. There was the increase in break-ins, and I think it was discussed at Police Services Board this morning, is quite marked. And some of the social media communication leads me to believe that there are people in our community that will take matters into their own hand. And it's certainly not an issue for county, but it is an issue that we often are referenced in. We are, people point to us and say, what can we do about it? I think I heard the Police Services Board this morning. I listened into it, and I believe that that matter is being addressed. So I'm happy to take that one off the list. Mr. Mayor, would you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Item 10, diversification of our communities. This is a quite subtle issue, quite sensitive issue, where we really need to learn from communities to the east of us how best to assimilate people who have different ethnicities, different religions into our community. And I can only say from my own experience when I've been campaigning that there are people in our community that will find it difficult. And I think it is something that we in council need to take a lead on. And I look to the mayor because he's probably more engaged in this than any of us. And whether you feel we need to do more as a council, whether we need to take any more actions to make this thing happen in the best possible way.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to you, Mr. Chair, I think that we are doing it in the best way. I think we're doing it quietly and constantly. I think we're doing what is asked of us and learning what is asked of us. And I think that if we take a more aggressive way right now, it would be a mistake. So I think you could take that off your list.
Yep. Generally agreed, Steve?
I do agree, and there was, just after the election, there were some questions on this topic. We all received some emails about that, and I think there are plans for some cultural diversity subcommittee type work, possibly, and maybe even part of the Arts, Culture, and Heritage Master Plan. I do know there was an email that came in just this week with some pointed questions related to some new property acquisition and changes within the county of Brant and some of the specific dynamics within that. And we responded by saying there are some, cultural sensitive issues there that we are learning about and respecting. So I do think it's that we are handling it as respectfully.
So the conclusion of this committee is we don't need to take any further action. We have it covered. Okay, Brian, got that? Thank you. Bylaw enforcement resourcing, I think, is going to come forward in budget. So I'm going to leave that item. I think that will get addressed. But it is a consequence of it's actually in the report we've had recently that particularly in respect of parking, we know that the demand on bylaw has increased. The number of enforcement calls has increased, and it's almost in direct proportion to population growth and the intensification of our residential communities. The two are very intimately linked, and I think the answer is through bylaw and through bylaw enforcement we can address that. We will face that issue in budget discussions next week. Anything you'd like to add, Greg?
We are trying to stay ahead of the curve as far as population growth, and I think we achieved that last year. We received a couple of bodies, municipal law enforcement officers, and some administrative support. We are looking to have additional support this year, but that is the challenge, is to stay ahead and maintain the service levels. And I believe if council wants to see enhanced services, we may have to go down that road, and we would look at potentially expanding the hours of operation. But that's something down the road. But right now, I think we're in pretty good shape.
Okay, thank you. Okay, item number 12, which is the availability of appropriate retail facilities. I put that on because I am regularly asked that question by residents, and I give them the stock answer that our job is to determine the zoning and of particular areas which can accommodate retail facilities, but there is both an economic question here and a question of being responsive and being able to answer questions passed to us by residents. If our residents can't shop in Paris, they will shop elsewhere. That is an economic loss to the community. But I think it also is a frustration that when I spoke to Russell Press, he undertook to speak to his connections and determine whether it was possible to encourage them to build retail stores, particularly grocery stores in the south of Paris. I heard Jennifer say that there's discussions going on, so if the public is listening to this, then I hope they can be encouraged that the council does take this seriously, that they are working towards it, and I'd welcome any additional comments from the committee. Seeing none, we'll move. Steve?
This is one where some inter-council communication might assist. Like we do often get asked about these things, and sometimes it's none of our business.
Mm-hmm.
But in the cases where some knowledge is accurately known, like if it is known that XYZ company is coming to Rest Acres Road, and maybe it's worth sharing that to the council in a Friday file. Such and such company has been confirmed as a tenant within the such and such property on Rest Acres Road. Just so that when people do ask us, we can honestly respond by saying we don't know, or yeah, actually that one's true, right?
Yeah, I think that's a very good suggestion. It actually increases the credibility of the councillors when they're able to respond either positively, and give a name, or positively and say we don't know. Right now, it's really don't know because we don't get told, and I think it seems like a gap that we can close. So, if we could record that as such, Brian, thank you. Any other comments on that one? Okay. Item 13: maintaining and developing pride in new communities. It is. I gave the example that John Pierce and I came across. It is one which may take time, but I do think it is a function that of people moving into our community that are new, that perhaps don't appreciate the way in which the community has been run previously. So this may just be a matter of time. I'm prepared to accept that it is a matter of time, but equally, we have a program of adopting roads, and people come along and they take that time, they clean the road. Perhaps we could encourage the similar situation for our parks, the edges of parks, because that was particularly the edge of a park. And I wonder whether anybody else has a comment. Steve?
So specific to that, I'm of a couple of different minds on this. I sometimes worry about the gentrification of Paris, about Paris becoming a high end posh community where where average folks may not be able to live comfortably or whatever. There's always been parts of Paris that were, more nicely kept, and other parts of Paris that maybe not as much. But we have a property standards bylaw, which I think is important when it comes to things like, hey, there's 5 sailboats parked on this guy's front lawn, those type of things, and we can use bylaw for those purposes. Specific to your point, though, about adopting roads and adopting parks, I think this is an area where, again, communication could help us connect the dots. We have great service clubs, Cub Scouts and Girl Guides and everything else who are who do great work in all aspects of our community. The adopt a road thing is not necessarily something that's very well publicized currently. It might have been 10 years ago, but I think it's kind of dropped off. So that's one where we may ask parks and roads and communications staff to kind of coordinate a messaging.
Yeah, we have no representative from that group today here, so we'll get it in the minutes, and I'll make sure I pass that suggestion to them. Any other commentary on that one? Okay, next item I had was a shift in the balance between home ownership and rental occupation. It's a subtlety, I think, that actually plays to the one above, is the experience that I've had in Southwest Paris, that the areas where we find the pride in ownership is diminished is where there is a higher level of rental occupation. And I think we just have to let that one play through and follow it through as we had for number 13. Item 15 I had was the trees issue, and Christine, you may want to just speak to that so that everybody's aware of the issue you wanted to raise.
Yeah, so the reason I flagged it is at the meeting where the images were shown of the backyard that I understand was the complainant on the zipline file that sort of kicked all of this off in the specific. Difficult to totally tell from the photo, but it appeared that they had planted 4 large shade trees in succession, one on each fence pole, which when fully grown could be 60 feet tall. Generally, a tree's canopy also matches its root structure, so as it grows out, not only might it affect the planter's property, but if the resident in an adjacent yard went to put an in-ground pool in, for example, the neighbor's tree's root structure is going to be in that pool within 10, 12 years. And this was, I guess this came to me when, as a thought when we were talking more about the backyards in isolation. I have absolutely no idea from a regulatory standpoint what one does with this, but it seems to me that if you're not allowed to put a man-made thing that is going to impede on others' use and enjoyment of their yard in a certain way, that one way to circumvent this would actually be through plant material. And what does this all kind of mean there?
So do we have any recommendations you'd like to make?
I don't have a recommendation. I flagged it when I thought we were perhaps having a different conversation here today. And I think the same would then be true of pollinators.
But is there a potential for a recommendation that says you should not plant this kind of tree in a small backyard?
I don't honestly know how we could go about doing it, and that's I think the piece, because and our forestry staff would probably comment that you need a certain level of expertise on plant ID, and we can't entirely save people from themselves. But if we were talking about use and enjoyment of one's own backyard and how others might get in the way of it, this was just in that.
But can I turn it, like I said, make it an educational piece where we actually recognizing what's happening in our community as we get smaller and smaller backyards. Should we be forthcoming and saying we recommend, for the benefit of all residents, not just yourself, that you perhaps avoid this particular kind of of tree or those particular kinds of trees?
I think it would be very difficult to come up with a specific there. As we, when the developers bring forward their plans, they have the landscape architects that have the street trees. There isn't any kind of heed paid to the rear yards. But to be honest with you, I don't know what we do about it. And I had thought we were more brainstorming than outcomes today, because I can't imagine sending bylaw to have to determine that someone's got a tulip tree and it needs to go.
No, I agree. So I'm thinking more about why we should perhaps make it an educational piece. So looking forward rather than looking back.
Yeah, I just worry that people find loopholes when they're mad about things, and that creates work.
John, you had it. Oh. Jim?
Oh, through the chair to Councillor Garneau. So there's a couple things in terms of the new subdivisions and development. So community services, there's a landscape architect who works with Michelle, our environmental planner. So they focus on native species. So they have the native species list. So they do the street trees, but then Michelle, as our environmental planner, works with Megan Thomas in terms of landscape plans. And of course, they always recommend native species. And we have actually a web page on our site. So we have an environmental page that also recommends all the native species. But when it comes down to people's specific properties itself, like planting on their own properties, I think that's, again, more of an education piece. So perhaps that's something that I know Michelle, our environmental planner, is very passionate about. So maybe you can connect with Michelle, and maybe she's very much into the stewardship and outreach, and maybe I think she's been working on some ideas. So that could be something you could look forward to. So,
Jen, is that something that can be turned into a more general communication that we share with developers, for example, and we might include it in packages for new home builders, new home buyers, rather?
Yeah, through you, Chair. So first of all, like for most communities, especially Michelle, who's if they're adjacent to natural systems or features, there's a homeowner guide that the developers prepare and that our environmental planner reviews, and it is ensuring the compatibility between our natural systems and also for the native species. So the homeowner's guide is prepared and given to all new owners in communities. And they're also given information when they first buy the homes as well. And then we work with the developers to ensure the plantings of those new subdivisions. But I think it's mostly the fact that, like, with established subdivisions too, and new developments, like there's a lot of invasive species that are being planted. We also have invasive species, but we work with the conservation authorities in terms of stewardship, because I know the hogweeds come up and there's tons of buckthorn and things like that. So perhaps that's something you could take away and maybe talk to Michelle about, and Megan Thomas is her name. So.
Well, that brings me to the, sorry.
The only thing I was going to add to that, and I came up with a constituent in the conversation, and because there's all these advantages of having these shade trees for saving energy in the houses and just the natural beauty of them and everything else. But it's not allowed in our older subdivisions, which is kind of in some areas anyway. So just a side point, but I like the direction that we're going.
Thank you. Well, that brings me to the end of my list, I believe. I'm going to draw the conclusion that we've covered off everything, that we found a home for each and every one of these items, and therefore the work of this committee is done. Does anybody have a different perspective? I'll take that as no, you don't. And I will say that this is the final meeting of the AdHoc subcommittee on urban intensification. I'll leave a parting thought. I think we have sliced this up piece by piece and convinced ourselves that we've got the thing under control. And I don't believe personally for a second that we've really understood the issue, and it is going to come and bite us as we go forward. So we'll conclude on that point. Thank you.
I'd like to make the motion to dissolve the ad hoc committee, please. Yeah, yeah. Seeking a seconder to.
Sorry, I'm just thinking, this wasn't where I thought we would be after 2 hours today, so
Well, I'm not sure I thought we would be here either, but I'm listening to the voices in the subcommittee, and the guidance I think I took was if we can see that any individual item is covered off. We may not have identified all the items, I can accept that, but I think when we identify an item, I think it's now the process we would follow, that we would point it towards the appropriate committee, and that the need for an ad hoc subcommittee is gone. I feel comfortable having got a motion supported by the subcommittee for the inappropriate structures in backyards. I feel satisfied that I've got what I wanted, the bare minimum of what I wanted out of it. I think collectively we scratched a surface here. I think there is a bigger issue that council should step back and look at. I think it is a collective leadership role that we need to play, and these were just a number of items, but there are lots of other items that collectively we need to lead on that are also being addressed by our staff at the moment, but still need I would call it a political overlay on that to represent the views of the community and our own collective views. So I thank everybody for that. Do you wish to say a comment, Mr. Mayor?
I think there were lessons learned today in this committee, but I do recall, there's a motion on the floor to dissolve the committee. It's been seconded, and I'd like you to call the vote again.
I thought I had called a vote.
We did?
Yeah, I did call the vote.
You had 3 in favor.
You abstained.
Thank you.
Can I abstain? Okay.
Yeah. So the vote was, the motion was carried. Thank you, and thanks to staff for coming along. I hope you found it interesting, maybe not constructive as you might have hoped, but interesting. Thank you. You and I are both learning in this process. Really are.
Goodness, I am just all kinds of confused as to how we got here and how we somehow departed from here.
Yeah, well, and what you saw was the mayor had no idea what we were talking about. Just assumed it was
The whole thing just went down the pipe.
But what we'll see, and what you will see,